Okay, welcome back. Today, what we are going to look at is the kinds of actions government and governmental bodies can make. And we're going to finally wrap up the climate unit by talking about these things, beginning with a carbon tax. And then we will review the entire unit and we'll be done with the climate change unit. So let's get started. Let's take a look at a carbon tax. The idea of a carbon tax would be a tax levied on all fossil fuels, and that would generate a pool of money. The underlying purpose of this is the idea that the polluter pays. Those who use the fossil fuels would pay. In theory, the tax should cover the external costs. So, for example, the cost to capture the carbon or to mitigate the carbon. The benefits of such a plan would be that it would encourage the development of alternative technologies and non-fossil fuel technologies, because it would make fossil fuels expensive and it would allow the other technologies to be relatively cheaper and therefore encourage them to be used. Two, it raises a bunch of revenue to do things like intensive research on alternatives, subsidize the development of alternatives, pay scientists to look into all sorts of aspects of using alternatives, and you could have multidisciplinary teams working on all sorts of ideas that would encourage low carbon lifestyle. Three, we like the efficiency of it because it makes companies and consumers pay the true cost, which is supposedly what the free market economy is about to begin with. So it's very satisfying that way. The problems with the carbon tax are that polluters may move to countries with lax laws, and this is why it would have to be a part of an international effort. There would be administrative costs associated with it, but that would create jobs. And cheating could be rampant, but then you would need an enforcement bureau that would deal with cheaters. It's true it's difficult to estimate the external costs, but to me that's not a problem, but an opportunity to hire some really clever economists to figure that out. Another potential drawback is that rich countries will be able to afford it and poor countries may suffer. But once again, if we fund alternatives, then we may find that that's not a problem. Let's now look at carbon trading, cap and trade programs. Remember, carbon trading permits each player to emit a certain amount of carbon dioxide. And then if they go above that amount, they have to pay a fine. And if they go below that amount, they can sell their additional rights on an open market to other companies, right? The number of permits would be decided by the government, and then the permits would be given to firms based on various criteria, and the firm could buy and sell those permits. If the firm wanted to emit more pollution, it would have to go out and buy permits. If it reduced its pollution, it could sell its surplus permits on the market. That would give it incentive to adopt cleaner technology because it could make money by selling its permits. And then the government could reduce permits over time, and this would allow companies to find solutions over time, which would make it a fairer process than saying tomorrow you have to be completely carbon free, or 2025 you have to be completely carbon free. You could schedule it in over time and make the pain of it less painful. The difficulty with this is complex. It's difficult to measure how much each firm is actually polluting, although I think that could be addressed. There's the free rider problem, that carbon emission is a global problem. If carbon trading is not introduced in every country at the same time, it may cause a shift of production from one country to another. But this is just more argument in my mind for why we need world government structures, not just national government structures. Nations fall prey to the tyranny of small decisions as well. And finally, the carbon tax is much simpler, it's much more transparent, and it's much easier to administer. Now, beyond those kind of economic incentives, and those are just two ideas, I'm sure there are brilliant economists out there who have other ideas as well. There are things governments can do by negotiating with other governments. And I want to just give you a very brief history of some of these. The first was called the Kyoto Protocol. It was a 1997 treaty designed to slow climate change. It called for the reduction of emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide by 2012 to 5.2% of the 1990 level. So the idea was in 1997, every country was going to commit to this, and we would be at 5.2% in a 15-year period. We wouldn't be in the state we're in today. Guess what? The U.S. didn't sign. as the biggest polluter. When the U.S. didn't sign, nobody else could take this seriously. They couldn't live up to it. So the U.S. completely scuttled that agreement. In 2009, there was the Copenhagen meetings. It was a non-binding agreement. It was all set to occur, and the Obama administration backed it, and they were there, and it was at that point that, as we'll see, right-wing interests, fossil fuel interests, released a fake scandal called ClimateGate. You'll see about this in the film, where ClimateGate was put out. Somehow the people who were saying climate change was happening were conspiratorial and were making up their data. And guess what? That was all false, but it was enough to scuttle the 2009 agreement. And since then, greenhouse gas emissions have increased 35% faster than what was predicted by the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. So things are getting worse, and this is a very frustrating process until the 2015 Paris Accord. And what happened? We will read an article about the 2015 Paris Accord, but basically the United States signed on for the first time, and everybody agreed to reduce greenhouse gases. And then we had the famous 2016 election, and we know that one of the first things Donald Trump did was to pull out of the Paris Accord. Now, that's a very frustrating history of the attempt to have international climate negotiations. Some governments are leading the way despite the fact that international agreements have not been able to hold together. So, for example, the government of Costa Rica is attempting to be carbon neutral by 2030. It is a tropical country, so it doesn't need to use fossil fuels for heating, which is a great thing. It already gets 78% of its electricity from hydropower and 18% from wind. So it's already well on the way. And we'll see how well they do. Sweden has committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2050. This is a much taller order because Sweden has very long and cold winters, being such a northern country. We will see how Sweden does, but from what I understand, it's already done a lot of things to get it towards its goal, and it may be moving up its carbon neutral date by a decade or so. We have developing nations of China and India that have the potential to have a devastating impact on climate change, and there is some indication that China is working on technologies to reduce greenhouse gases, even though emissions are still very high, and hopefully India will do the same. In the United States, what we've seen recently is cities and states are taking the initiative to reduce carbon emissions. Portland, Oregon has reduced greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels, while the rest of the country has increased by 16%. California has set greenhouse gas emission targets for 2020 and has already met them. However, it is being sued by the Trump administration currently because of these targets. There are institutions that are reducing their carbon footprints. I know both Oberlin and Yale have done a tremendous amount to try to become carbon neutral institutions. I don't know much about their programs, but that would be an interesting thing to look into later on in the year. So what can you do? Well, we've already looked at our carbon footprint. We've already seen that it would be difficult but not impossible to reduce our carbon footprint. And that if we were forced to do it, we probably could do a good job. For example, if gas was $10 or $15 a gallon, I probably wouldn't drive to school every day, but me and the kids, we would bike. I know that's supposed to be the kids and I would bike. Every serious analysis has shown that without major changes in how things get done in societies, what fuels are promoted and developed, what technologies are subsidized, how cities are organized, the availability of mass transit, that individuals can make little difference by changing their usage. This, of course, implies that the way to address climate change is for all of us to become more political and spend more time really demanding that our politicians look out for the public good and not just pander to our baser instincts or to the interests of large corporations. I would say that by changing the way we do things individually, we can serve as role models for how to live in the future, and we can inspire others to become active political agents. I would say that it can still be important for individuals to change their lifestyle, but that by itself, buying a Prius is not going to save the planet. So, to review, here is what we have found in this video. We have an old model, and by old I mean it's been worked on by a lot of scientists, and it accounts for and predicts global temperature very well. Global temperature is a complex process, as is global climate. The model works really well, and using the changing CO2 concentrations that we have seen generated by humans accurately predicts the change in temperature already observed. If anything, the models are a little conservative. They're underestimating the temperature change, the heating of the Earth. The model, importantly, was developed before the issue was politicized. We can measure how much carbon dioxide humans create each year and then put that into the model and see what we'd expect the new concentration of CO2 to be and how that should affect the warming of the planet. And indeed, we see that the models predict human CO2 is going to make the planet warmer. We have measured the change in CO2 in the atmosphere. It's increasing rapidly. There are multiple lines of evidence showing that the Earth's temperature is actually increasing. The model allows us to predict not only current concentrations and temperatures, but also those in the future under various scenarios. And finally, events like El Nino demonstrate how changes in wind and temperature can cause drastic change in global climate. And thus, it is not a far reach to suggest that warming will cause similar type climate change. Indeed, climate scientists believe that climate change is the inevitable result of warming. And I would ask, is there something else that is needed to feel confident about the direction the planet is headed? Are we sure exactly where it's headed? No. But do we feel that rapid warming is going to cause a lot of headaches for humans and non-humans alike in the future? That seems pretty certain. In fact, I would say that seems 100% certain. The takeaway, just to review the review, scientific evidence links human activity to warming and links the warming to harmful consequences. Reducing the effects requires emergency action. We've talked about that in the class. But it is currently not clear that there's the political willpower to make the necessary changes in any of the nations that most contribute to the problem. How do we change that? And look, I left this in here. Are the 2015 Accords a start? Well, they've been scuttled by the U.S. Can we recover them with a new president in 2020? Great question. I don't know the answer. We are making history as we go. So that's it for today. Until next time, study hard.